Hey everyone, welcome back to Jesse's Shed. We've just finished servicing the PW50, so now we're going to move on to the TTR-50. This is a 4-stroke electric start bike, so there's a couple of more things to service on it, but overall it's still a very easy bike to work on at home and to do with basic skills and basic tools. Today we're going to cover dropping the oil and replacing that, changing the spark plug, checking the valve gap on this, adjusting your chain and lubing it, cleaning your air filter, and then generally just having a go over the bike and making sure things are adjusted right, like the brakes, and just making sure everything's done up nice and tight and is ready for someone to ride. So as I mentioned, you only need basic tools for this, really just a socket set, a Phillips head screwdriver, possibly a set of pliers, and then just your replacement oil, some off-road lube for the chain, air filter, spray, and a new spark plug. And then just something to drop the oil in and to refill it with. That's about it, really.
So the first thing you want to do is get all of the plastics off the bike so you can get access to everything. All there is a few 10mm bolts and a couple of Phillips head screws, and everything else just clips off.
So now that everything's off the bike, you can get good access to all the parts that you need to service. We've got our spark plug down the front here, and this is the cover that we'll take off to check the valve gap. We've got the chain, which you can see is very, very loose on this bike, so I'm going to have to adjust that. We're going to drop the oil. To do that, there's a bolt down the bottom here that we undo. That'll drain out, and then the filler plug is on the other side. If you haven't charged it in a while, here's where the battery sits on the bike. It's always a good idea to give it a really good charge, because they really don't charge very well if they're just start-stop with a kid that's not riding the thing very hard. And then this is where our air filter is. We'll take that out and clean it out and re-oil it. After that, it's just going to be adjusting the rear brake and the front brake, and then checking over the bike and making sure that everything else is secured and working well. The first thing that I like to do is the air filter, because it gives it time to dry after you clean it out. With these air filters, they have a little runoff cap here that you want to check that's not full of oil. If the bike's been dropped and left on its side for any period of time, oil will actually run up into the air filter and will accumulate here. So just check that before you pull it off. If there is oil in it, you've got to take this off and let it drain out. If you're having trouble starting your bike, you've dropped it and the thing just won't start, it's a good idea to have a check of that, because 9 times out of 10, that's filled up with oil and flooded your filter, and you're not going to get any air to the bike, so it won't start. These bikes, interestingly, they don't have a oil filter for some reason, and I think it's quite sort of crude, the oil delivery system on these bikes, and the fact that it can run out so easily, because these bikes are dropped a lot. So once you've undone those 3 screws, the air filter just pops off, and that's it in there. Very basic, it's just a foam air filter. You can see the amount of junk that's collected. So it's doing its job. The other side is nice and clean. And then you've got your macro filter there, which is going to... Now to clean the air filter, there are all sorts of chemicals you can use. I find it's always easy just to use petrol. I'm not advocating this if you've got any aversion to working with petrol, and obviously you shouldn't have any naked flames or anything around, but the oil that's in these dissolves really well if you put it in petrol. Give it a squeeze, and you'll just see that dirt start pouring out that's embedded in that. Interestingly, this is a smaller air filter than in the PW50, but it also stays a lot cleaner. The bike itself is a lot taller than the PW50, and the air filter itself is off the ground more, so it doesn't seem to suck in quite as much. Just from that very quick clean though, there's a lot of dirt and sediment that's come out of that, so it's well worth cleaning. So all I do, I just soak it, give it a few rinses, replace that petrol then and do it again so that you've got completely clean fuel and it's going to get the remainder out. And then I set this aside and just let it dry right out while I'm doing the oil and the spark plug. Your spark plug is located on the right hand side of the engine, just here in the center. You just pull the lead off. It's a 5/8 bit that fits over it. And it just comes out really easily. I've shown in other videos, I always put a bit of dielectric grease around the threads of the spark plug. It helps it get better connection and makes it easy to come out when you do remove it. It's in there. The replacement plug is a CR7 HSA and the plug gap on it is 0.6 to 0.7 mil. So just use a set of feeler gauges and make sure that that gap's correct. So while your spark plugs are out, you want to do your valve timing because it makes it a lot easier to turn the motor around. We've got two caps that we've got to take off. The intake cap here, which is next to your intake from your carburetor, and then your exhaust, which is next to your exhaust. We've then got two more caps here. The large one here we're going to use to turn the motor to get to top dead center. And then this is our inspection port here, which has a mark in it that I'll show up close. And that's how you get to top dead center. So I'll take those off quickly and then we'll start timing it. These caps up the top here are a 24 mil. They have a rubber O-ring under them, so they're not normally done up too tight. Just make sure you grab that O-ring, don't lose it. That's one. That's two. So now we want to have a large flathead screwdriver to take out these caps. They also shouldn't be in terribly tight. They've got O-rings on them as well. So to find top dead center, we want to have a 17 mil socket that you put on the large nut there. Then this is our inspection port. And we're going to see that point there is going to line up with a mark on the flywheel. It's going to be, there'll be 3 marks and it's the center one that we want to go to. While you're doing this, as you crank it, you'll see your valves go up and down. You want to do it on the stroke that the valves are up so that you have the gap there. If you're on the wrong stroke, the valves will be depressed like this. And that's the wrong stroke, as you won't have any lash or gap there to check. So you just let them come up and then keep on turning. You want to turn counterclockwise until you see these marks come up, and then we line with the second mark, which is right there. That's top dead center. You can verify that by putting something down your bore while the spark plug's out, and you'll be able to feel the piston right at the top. Obviously don't put something down there that you can drop into the bore. Now that we've got top dead center, you should have a little bit of gap and movement in your valves there. You want to measure the gap in between that adjustment screw and the actual top of the valve. For the intake, this is 0.05 millimeters to 0.09 millimeters. And for the exhaust, it's 0.08 and 0.12 millimeters. You want to use a feeler gauge like this. You might find that you can't get it in straight, so like I've done, you bend the feeler gauge and then that'll let you get it down and in between, and it should just graze through and you should be able to put it in and out of that gap fairly easily and just feel it touching on either side. If you've had to adjust it, make sure that you do that lock nut back up, and then you can put that new spark plug back in there with a bit of dielectric grease on it, and we're ready to move on to the oil. Don't do these up crazy tight because they have O-rings in them that keep it sealed. If you torque it down too far, you risk stripping it or seizing it on. As I mentioned earlier, the drain plug is down here. This is a 17 mil, so you just need a 17 mil socket and chuck your pan underneath, and we'll let that oil drain out. There's no filter to take out on these bikes, so we've just got to drain it and then refill it. While the oil's draining, you can re-oil your air filter now. By this stage, it should be nice and dry. You just want to have a good quality air filter spray. and give it a good coating, but don't completely soak the thing to where it's pouring out. You'll clog it up otherwise. So it's just a good spray all over, and then I just sort of massage it down into the foam, and it'll all soak through as that solvent dries out on it. That's all you need. You can see it's covered the whole way on both sides now. Give it a bit of a squeeze, it just runs through all of the pores of that foam. Then we're ready to put it back on the bike. While the oil is still draining, we can adjust the chain now. The free play in here should be 35 to 45 millimeters. This is a lot more on this bike. It's because it's fairly new, this chain's had time to stretch, so it needs to be adjusted up. To do this, we want to loosen off the axle nut here, and then these are our adjusters. There's one on either side, and if you look closely on the swing arm, there are these little adjustment notches. There's a little mark here that lines up with that, and you need to line that up exactly the same on both sides so that you know that the wheel's on straight. You see on the other side, currently it's lined up on this third or the second large notch, the third notch along. So we want to pull it back this way, and that's going to pull the wheel back and tighten that chain. And then we can do these little lock nuts back up and make sure that those notches, whichever one you've chosen, make sure it's the same on this side as on the other side. So once you've got your chain to where you want it, it's 35 to 45 mil as I mentioned, you want to then do up your lock nuts on either side and then do up the axle nut as well. Once they're all done up, before you put the guards back on, just give that chain an oil. Mine's not very dirty, but if it is, you want to degrease the whole chain. You can normally do that before you start working on the bike. And then the easiest way is just tilt it up off the stand to where you can rotate the wheel, and then just spray some of this on there. Don't go mental on it to where it's dripping off everywhere, because it just makes a mess. But if you've got somebody to help you, it can be a lot easier because you can spin it and spray it at the same time. By the time you've done this, the oil will probably almost be finished draining. If it does stop, make sure you tip the bike up, because you'll find that oil does run down into other galleries and you'll actually get a lot more out. Mine had stopped running. You can see how much more is coming out now. While that's finishing off, really the only other things to check is your brake adjustment. You want to make sure that there's no tension on the brake when it's released, but there's not any sort of slack when you start pushing it. It should be an instant movement. You adjust this nut here if there is, and just pull it up until there is no slack, but make sure it's not engaging when that brake lever is released. It's the same thing for the rear. This is your adjustment nut here. If you have moved your chain back a long way, you can find that this could be pulling in and it could be not releasing. It's always engaged. You need to just loosen this nut off a few turns, and that'll allow the slack to come back into it. The last thing is your accelerator. This bike's pretty new and there's quite a bit of slop in that where the cable has stretched from new. To adjust that, there's a lock nut here and then another long nut here that you undo and then extend that, and you want to extend the gap in between this nut and the housing of the carburetor here. That'll shorten the cable effectively and it will bring the bike back into spec. You just want to make sure that you don't extend it that far that it's actually always engaging the carburetor, because if it does, you're going to have a high idle, or the bike's just not going to run properly. This is how much adjustment mine needed. One thing, if you go too far, if you listen carefully, you won't hear the carburetor seat. That's just the handle going back at the moment. If I loosen this off a little bit, you can hear the click of the carburetor fully closing. That's where you're at your right point, where there's no slack, but it's also not going to be a high idle because the carburetor is slightly open still. Once you're happy with that position, you just spin this lock nut all the way up and then pull it tight against this long nut, and that will lock it off and stop it from moving until your next adjustment. So we finally got all of the oil out of the bike. As you can see here from the measuring cup, there's actually 900 mils of oil that's come out of it. From factory, they've overfilled it, and it's not good for your engine. We did have a few problems when this bike was tipped over, where that little cap would fill up with oil quite easily in the air filter, this little one here. And I'd say that's why, because there's just been too much oil in the bike. The manual and both the side of the case tell you there should be 800 mils that go into it, so I'm going to replace it with 800 mils of 10W40. I just use Silcolene, change it every 10 hours, or however long. If the bike sits around, I'll do it every few months, and then I know the bike's going to be running well and there's no more contaminants or nasties to get up into that engine. So you just want to grab yourself a funnel, 800 mils of oil, pour it in. I actually tend to put about 750 in, and then I check it on the dipstick, and then I'll add the extra as I need it. It's better to underfill it slightly and add some more than have to dump more out. So to check your oil, you've actually got a dipstick on these bikes. There's max and min, and then you just want to start the bike, let it run for a few minutes, turn it off, and then let it cool down for a couple of minutes. Bring the bike up to a level position, and you put the dipstick in, but don't screw it in. Just push it into where it seats. Take it out. And your oil should be, mine's about halfway on the dipstick at the moment. That's because I left that 50 mils out. I'll fill it up a bit more, and then it should be right at the top.
And that's it. All there is left to do is put all the plastics back on, check that your tyres are at 15 PSI, and then check over all the bolts, make sure you did everything back up nice and tight, throw it back together. As always, I hope this helps you out in some sort of way. If it did, consider subscribing, give me a like and a comment, and join me next time for the next video. Thank you.